It started with a paintbrush and ended with a flashbang in my birdbath. No, seriously, that's not a joke. One minute I was repainting my own backyard fence in forest green while wearing SpongeBob pajama pants and listening to a podcast about unsolved crimes. The next minute I was staring at a dozen tactical boots marching across my lawn and a megaphone blaring from a police cruiser demanding I drop my brush and lie face down on the grass. My dog Barkley howled like he was in a horror movie and knocked over a can of paint while a drone hovered overhead. The craziest part, one hadn't even finished one panel of the fence yet. And that's how Karen from the HOA nearly got me arrested for felony fence coloring. Rewind just 4 hours earlier. It was a sunny Saturday and I finally had a free day to check something off my long overdue to-do list. My backyard fence had been weathered to the point it looked like driftwood at a haunted dock. I had picked up a can of forest green exterior paint that matched the surrounding trees and brought the brush out with pride. It was my property, my fence, my weekend, and I had no idea that the next 48 hours would involve a fraudulent citation, a hijacked HOA meeting, a viral Reddit video, and one of the most chaotic police overreactions in suburban history. As I laid down the first few strokes of paint, I saw her, Karen, or as the HOA calls her chairwoman, Karen. She lives directly behind me and has binoculars aimed at my yard more often than she waters her plant. I noticed her blinds twitch, and within 10 seconds she had stomped out her back door in a robe, slippers, and the fury of someone who just discovered a nuclear threat next door. She marched to the property line waving a 3-ring binder labeled HOA Standards like it was the Bible of suburban living. "Excuse me," she shouted without a hint of irony, "are you authorized to paint that fence? That's not an approved color." I looked at my fence, then at her, then back at the paint. It was green. Not neon. Not striped. Not glowing in the dark. Just green. I told her I checked the neighborhood documents, and there was no mention of backyard fence color restrictions. She scoffed, said I was mistaken, and that she'd be submitting an emergency citation. Then she pulled out her phone and began snapping pictures of me, like she was collecting evidence for the FBI. I laughed it off. I'd dealt with Karen before. She once fined a neighbor for having Halloween decorations up 2 days past October 31st. Another time she tried to get a 6-year-old banned from riding a scooter on the sidewalk because it was too noisy. I figured her HOA complaint would go nowhere, and I continued painting. That was my first mistake. 2 hours later, a knock at my front door interrupted my brushwork. It was Dave, a sheepish-looking HOA committee member holding a printed citation. It read unauthorized exterior alteration with a fine of $250. I asked him what exactly was altered, and he stuttered something about non-standard hue variance before mumbling that Karen had rewritten part of the HOA code that very morning and that technically it hadn't been voted on yet, but she insisted it was enforceable immediately. I couldn't even finish my sentence before Dave bolted like a kid delivering bad news on a dare. At this point I was half irritated, half amused. I took a picture of the citation, posted it online with the caption, "Just got fined $250 for painting my fence green. Guess my backyard's too rebellious." Within an hour it had 700 likes on Reddit. Within 2 it had 5,000. Then something snapped in Karen. Or maybe she'd already been snapped and this was her unraveling thread. From inside my house I could hear Karen yelling on the phone. She paced along her yard muttering things like violation, safety hazard, unauthorized activity, and I swear I heard the word emergency at least 6 times. My neighbor Ron leaned over the fence and whispered, "You might want to record this." I raised an eyebrow and turned on my phone's camera just in time to see Karen make her boldest move yet. She dialed 911 and told the operator, "I need immediate response. There's a man violating code enforcement, possibly armed with chemicals, and being aggressively non-compliant." I laughed because I thought she was bluffing. She wasn't. 10 minutes later 2 squad cars pulled up. Then a third. I stepped outside holding nothing but a paintbrush and a cup of lemonade and was told sternly to remain where I was. I tried to explain that this was my fence and my yard, and that there was no crime occurring. But they said they had a report of a hazardous material being applied without clearance. I stared at them and pointed at the paint can. Non-toxic latex. Home Depot's safest line. One officer looked embarrassed. The other radioed something in. And then it escalated further. A SWAT van rolled into the cul-de-sac. I thought it was a prank. Barkley started barking wildly. One officer drew a taser. Another instructed me to step back while a team in tactical gear surrounded my garden gnome. I swear I'm not exaggerating. A neighbor across the street streamed the entire thing live while their kid commentated like it was an esports tournament. Eventually, after realizing there was no threat, no weapon, and no criminal intent, the police de-escalated. But not before tossing a flashbang as part of their approach protocol, which exploded harmlessly in my birdbath, sending water flying and birds scattering like fireworks had gone off. I was zip-tied for 5 full minutes until someone checked the paint label and verified I wasn't some rogue chemist trying to poison the HOA through osmosis. The SWAT commander apologized and asked if I wanted to press charges for false reporting. I looked over at Karen, who was pretending to hyperventilate while fake crying into her garden gloves. I said no, not yet. Because I had bigger plans. I had a fence to finish and a Karen to expose. That night my video hit the front page of Reddit. Local news picked it up. The title read "Man Painting Fence Causes SWAT Standoff in Suburbia." My inbox was flooded with messages. People from all over the country began sharing their own Karen horror stories. I knew this wasn't just a weird incident. It was the beginning of something massive. Because if Karen wanted war over a green fence, then I was ready to paint the whole neighborhood. And I hadn't even opened the anonymous email in my inbox yet. The one with the subject line "Karen's HOA reign is built on lies." Things were about to go from ridiculous to revolutionary. And the paint was still drying. The next morning, my front lawn looked like a war zone cleanup crew had visited overnight. Bits of splintered mulch, the shattered remains of my birdbath, and one black zip tie still half buried in the grass reminded me that yesterday hadn't been some fever dream. Barkley refused to go outside without his leash, which he usually hated, and every time he saw a lawnmower or a jogger, he barked like it was the return of the tactical squad. I made coffee, sat on the porch, and opened my inbox. That's when I saw it. The email with the subject line "Karen's HOA reign is built on lies." There was no sender name, just an address I didn't recognize and a message that began with, "If you want to take her down, start with the color code scam." I didn't know who sent it, but I clicked the attachment and found something both hilarious and infuriating, a side-by-side comparison of the HOA bylaws from last year and the ones Karen had uploaded to the community portal the morning of the incident. Sure enough, the document had been tampered with. The original version had no mention of backyard fence colors, only front-facing public view restrictions. The updated version had a whole new section labeled subsection 3C. Rear perimeter paint limitations, and the font didn't even match. It looked like Karen had copy-pasted it from some random legal form template online. Even better, the metadata from the PDF file had her name embedded in the author field. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then slowly smiled. She had forged HOA rules to justify a fake violation, and now I had the proof. I forwarded the file to Riley, my old college roommate who now practiced real estate and property law. He called me 10 minutes later laughing so hard he couldn't breathe. He said this wasn't just a dumb power move. It was a legitimate case of document falsification, possibly fraud. We both knew Karen probably didn't understand how serious that was, especially if she had done this before. I asked him if I should confront her directly. He told me to wait. Instead, he suggested we collect more evidence, see how far the corruption went, and then expose it all in one dramatic sweep. That same afternoon, I got a knock at my door. It was Greg from 3 houses down, holding his phone and shaking his head. He had seen the Reddit video and came to tell me he once got fined for using non-regulation flower pot. Apparently, Karen had told him his ceramic planters were too loud in tone and clashed with the neighborhood's earth tone palette. He ended up paying the fine just to avoid the drama. Now that he knew what she'd done to me, he said he wanted to help. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one. Karen had been terrorizing the neighborhood one absurd citation at a time. Over the next few days, I began hearing stories from neighbors I barely knew. One woman named Eliza said Karen reported her for excessive wind chime usage. A man on the next street told me Karen once took pictures of his trash bins and emailed them to the city sanitation office claiming his schedule didn't align with community guidelines. None of this was in any official code. Karen was simply making things up, bullying people with fake policies, and most people had no idea they could fight back. But now they did. I decided to dig deeper. I logged into the HOA online portal where all community rules and documents were kept. After a few hours of clicking and scrolling, I discovered multiple versions of bylaws saved under different timestamps, all uploaded by Karen. Every few months, the documents had slight edits. Sometimes it was a line about allowable porch decorations. Other times it was something ridiculous like requiring pre-approval for holiday inflatables. But the biggest red flag was that none of these changes had meeting minutes or board votes to back them up. I sent everything to Riley, who confirmed that by California HOA law, all amendments must be passed via vote and logged in public record. Karen had skipped that entirely. She'd simply edited the rules like it was her personal Sims neighborhood and enforced them with citations that had no legal standing. Riley started drafting a formal complaint. I started planning something louder. To get the community truly on board, I needed to show them what she was doing, not just tell them. So I printed enlarged versions of the original and altered documents and highlighted the key changes. Then I went door to door, talking to every neighbor who had been fined or harassed. I showed them the proof, listened to their stories, and handed each person a simple flyer that read, "Karen is not the law. Come to the HOA emergency meeting this Friday." Karen didn't know yet, but her days as HOA dictator were numbered. By Thursday, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. You could hear people whispering across fences, see groups gathering on driveways, and for once, nobody was afraid of Karen. Even her own next-door neighbor, a quiet guy named Marcus who usually kept to himself, put up a sign in his window that said, "Paint it all," in bold green letters. Karen must have sensed the shift because that evening she emailed the entire community warning them that a campaign of misinformation is being spread by a known violator, and that attendance at unauthorized meetings would result in further citations. That email only made people angrier. Friday arrived and I wasn't sure what to expect. But when I showed up to the community center where HOA meetings were held, there were nearly 40 people already inside. Chairs were pulled up. Some people brought snacks. It looked less like a meeting and more like a rebellion. Karen strutted in 15 minutes late, holding her infamous binder, and wearing a blazer that looked like it had never seen sunlight. She scanned the room and realized fast that the vibe was different. Her usual smug smile twitched at the edges. She began the meeting by saying we'd be addressing community concerns regarding conduct and violations, but I stood up immediately and said we'd actually be discussing the illegal alteration of HOA policy documents. Riley, who had driven down just to be there, stood beside me and handed out printed copies of the document analysis. Karen's face went pale. She sputtered something about interpretation and formatting preferences, but no one was buying it. One neighbor raised their hand and asked why the HOA color code had changed without a vote. Another asked why she had multiple versions of the bylaws saved under her login. Karen tried to redirect, but Riley interrupted with a quote from state law that said bylaws must be passed through a transparent and recorded voting process. Then he held up the email metadata showing Karen's name attached to the forged PDF. Karen snapped. She shouted that we were attacking her, that she had done everything to protect property values, and that if we didn't like how she ran the neighborhood we could try running it ourselves. That's when someone in the back said, loudly and clearly, "We plan to." The room erupted in claps and cheers. Karen stormed out, binder flapping, face red and twitching. But the damage was done. Everyone had seen the truth. The lies were exposed. And for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt like it belonged to the people again. The meeting ended with a vote to suspend all recent citations and schedule a new board election. As I walked home, neighbors clapped me on the back and said things like "Thanks for standing up, and we needed this for so long." But I wasn't done yet, because I still had one more surprise waiting. An anonymous message had arrived while I was speaking at the meeting. It contained video footage of Karen's backyard, aerial footage. And what it revealed was going to blow this story wide open. She wasn't just faking documents. She was breaking the law on her own property too. And soon, everyone would know. The moment I opened the video attachment, I nearly dropped my phone. Shot from a drone camera, the footage swooped over Karen's backyard like a spy satellite in a nature documentary. Her lot, which everyone assumed ended just behind her hydrangeas, actually extended into an overgrown, fenced-off section that most people thought belonged to the utility company. But there it was, an illegally installed underground hot tub, a storage shed wider than some garages, and even what looked like a buried propane tank, half concealed under gravel and vines. I paused and replayed the video twice just to be sure. Karen, the same woman who fined people for lawn gnomes, had been running her own unapproved construction project like a secret compound, and it was all sitting right in the HOA's blind spot. I didn't know who had taken the video, but the timestamp and GPS metadata were real. It was clear someone in the neighborhood wanted Karen exposed and had been quietly gathering intel for a while. Along with the video was a second message. She threatened my family with fines when we tried to build a pergola. Expose her. She's been hiding this for years. I didn't recognize the email address, but it didn't matter. Karen had used fear to control the HOA, and now her neighbors were beginning to push back from the shadows. Riley was the first person I called. I told him about the video, the underground tub, the propane tank, all of it. He asked me to forward everything immediately. 10 minutes later, he texted me a list of violations so long I had to scroll. Unpermitted gas line installation. Violation of local setback ordinances. Illegal outbuilding exceeding height limit. If she had skipped even one inspection, it could trigger a chain reaction with the city code enforcement department. And best of all, Riley knew a guy, an ex-city inspector named Tom, who now worked as a private consultant. Tom had a history with HOA corruption and loved nothing more than exposing backyard hypocrisy. I agreed to set up a meeting. Before we met with Tom, I needed more than drone footage. I needed documentation, permits, property lines. So I did what any mildly obsessive citizen would do. I spent an entire afternoon at the city records office. The clerk behind the counter looked mildly alarmed when I asked for plot diagrams and construction permits for Karen's address. I told her I was investigating an issue for legal purposes and, perhaps out of boredom or curiosity, she printed everything without asking too many questions. What I got was pure gold. Karen's original plot line ended 7 feet before the shed began. Her property permit showed no mention of a hot tub, no propane installation, and no permission for outbuildings larger than 10 by 10. Hers was at least 16 by 20 and built on a concrete foundation. It was all illegal. And the best part? I found an old request submitted by her nearly 5 years ago, one that had been rejected due to flood zone concerns. She built it anyway. That evening, I shared everything with Riley and Tom at a diner near City Hall. Tom nearly choked on his sandwich laughing when he saw the overhead image of Karen's DIY disaster. He said it was a miracle the propane tank hadn't exploded. He also said he'd be happy to accompany me on an anonymous tip call to the city code office the next morning. Apparently, a complaint coming from a known attorney and certified inspector got taken very seriously. Meanwhile, the neighborhood was waking up. Ever since the emergency HOA meeting, residents had been talking like never before. A group chat called Freedom Fence Watch had sprung up with dozens of neighbors posting stories, photos, and rumors about Karen's antics. Someone had uploaded a copy of the bylaws with a poll asking which fake rule annoyed them most. Another person edited Karen's head onto a Game of Thrones poster titled Queen of Citations. It was absurd, hilarious, and just what we needed to keep momentum. For once, the whole community was united not in fear, but in laughter. Then came the city inspection. At exactly 9 a.m., 3 trucks pulled up to Karen's house. One was marked Code Enforcement, another Zoning Department, and the third bore the logo of the local fire marshal. I stayed far away, but I wasn't the only one watching. About a dozen people lined the street, pretending to walk dogs, sweep porches, or fiddle with mailboxes. Karen came out in a silk robe and immediately tried to wave them off with her binder. But Tom, dressed in his consultant vest, pointed at the propane tank and called in a potential fire code violation. The city officials stepped around her like she didn't exist. It escalated quickly. One officer began measuring the shed while another crawled under her deck with a flashlight. Karen screamed something about harassment, about fake neighbors and sabotage, but nobody cared. A second truck arrived with 2 uniformed officers from the gas utility company. One of them began cutting off access to the unapproved fuel line. Karen tried to physically block them. That's when she was calmly escorted back to her porch by a zoning agent and told she was being cited for obstruction of inspection. The irony was delicious. I didn't film the whole thing, but plenty of neighbors did. By the time I walked back to my house, my phone was already buzzing. Someone had posted a 5-minute highlight reel of the inspection complete with dramatic music edit. Another person edited in text overlays like, "This shed is a lie," and "Karen's fallout shelter exposed." It was everywhere by lunch. By that afternoon, the city issued an official notice declaring the propane tank unsafe, the shed non-compliant, and the tub in violation of sanitary installation code. Karen was slapped with a $5,000 fine and given 7 days to submit plans for either full removal or appeal. She didn't speak to anyone. She didn't storm around the yard. She just slammed her door and stayed inside. But this wasn't over. The next morning, I received another anonymous tip. This time, it was a blurry photo of Karen and a man in a suit exchanging envelopes near the HOA office during off-hours. The message read, "You're not the first person she's gone after. But you might be the last." The person sending this clearly wanted her empire to fall. And I wasn't stopping now. Riley began filing paperwork to formally request a community audit of HOA fund. If Karen had manipulated bylaws and citations, what was stopping her from messing with the budget? We'd seen odd charges before. Landscaping fees that never materialized. Security upgrades that consisted of nothing but laminated signs. If we could prove she'd siphoned funds or used HOA money for her personal projects, it would be the final nail in the coffin. That night, I sat by my now famous green fence. It had been untouched since the incident. Not one more brushstroke. But I didn't mind. Because it wasn't just a fence anymore, it was a line in the sand. A declaration. Karen had turned it into a battlefield, and now it was a monument to resistance. I looked around and saw porch lights flicking on, neighbors talking across driveways, kids riding scooters without being scolded. Things felt normal. No, better than normal. Free. I wasn't sure who sent the drone. I wasn't sure who snapped the photo by the HOA office. But I did know one thing. Karen had built her kingdom on forged documents, intimidation, and fear. But her empire was cracking. And the people she stepped on were no longer quiet. And if she thought a paintbrush was dangerous, just wait until she saw what we had planned next. The next few days were a strange mix of tension and anticipation, like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath, waiting to see if Karen would go down swinging or vanish into disgrace. But this was Karen we were talking about, the self-proclaimed queen of compliance, the woman who once threatened to fine a neighbor for having Christmas lights still up on January 2nd. So of course she didn't retreat quietly. She did what she always did when backed into a corner: she doubled down and got louder. Early Monday morning, a mass email went out from her official HOA chairwoman account. It was 3 pages long and somehow managed to be both aggressive and riddled with typos. She accused the community of staging an unlawful rebellion, claimed the city's inspection was a smear campaign, and called me, by name, an unhinged vigilante with a vendetta against neighborhood harmony. She even attached a screenshot of my green fence and labeled it Exhibit A, visual aggression. It might have been pathetic if it weren't also incredibly hilarious. People screenshotted the email and began sharing it in the neighborhood group chat with edits like Exhibit B, emotional damage, and Exhibit C, my lawn has PTSD. But while the residents laughed, I stayed focused, because this was exactly the kind of flailing response someone gives when they know they're losing. And Karen was losing fast. The audit Riley requested had already been accepted by the interim HOA board, now led by Greg, who had been voted in during a special meeting. The board had reviewed records going back 3 years, and what they were finding wasn't just questionable, it was criminal. Karen had reimbursed herself for a number of so-called community purchases without any receipts or approval. Items like security consulting, aesthetic enhancements, and the mysterious parking enforcement incentives. One payment of over $1,200 was marked as weed control demo, but no one remembered any such event, and when Riley called the landscaping company listed, they said they'd never heard of the HOA. Another charge was for a digital signboard that was supposed to go at the neighborhood entrance, but it never appeared. As it turned out, the invoice address was traced to a P.O. box registered to a Karen M. Hargrove. It didn't stop there. In the course of digging through the audit, they discovered she had paid her nephew, yes, the same one who once pretended to be her legal advisor, to produce custom HOA pamphlets and warning slip. She'd charged the association triple the market rate and used fear tactics to distribute hundreds of these fake violation notices to residents, banking hundreds of dollars in fee payments directly into the HOA's now questionable operating fund. When confronted, she had an answer for everything, most of them as vague as they were useless. But no one was listening anymore. The dam had finally broken. Still, Karen wasn't done lashing out. 2 days after the email, a man in an ill-fitting suit arrived at my house and handed me a cease and desist letter. According to him, I was being accused of defamation, conspiracy, and what Karen had dramatically labeled community destabilization. Riley laughed out loud when I showed it to him. The letter was a joke, clearly written by someone with a Google Doc template and no understanding of actual legal process. It even misspelled my last name in the header. Riley suggested we frame it. Meanwhile, Karen began trying to recruit supporters. She knocked on doors, handed out flyers printed on her home printer, and claimed the board election had been illegitimate due to undue influence and radicalism. But nobody was buying it anymore. Her authority had crumbled, and her desperation was now on full display. One neighbor, a retired judge named Carol, invited Karen onto her porch to talk. Karen, thinking she had a new ally, launched into a speech about neighborhood decay and legal overreach. Carol listened patiently, then handed her a printed packet of the audit findings and told her she was under investigation for embezzlement. Karen left in silence. Then came the final blow. On Friday, the city returned for a follow-up inspection, this time with law enforcement in tow. Karen was given a formal order to dismantle the illegal shed and remove the unpermitted propane tank immediately. When she refused and began screaming that her property was being invaded, officers calmly informed her that failure to comply would result in immediate legal action. That's when she made her biggest mistake yet. She pushed one of the code officers and shouted that they were part of a neighborhood coup. Within seconds, she was handcuffed on her front lawn, surrounded by stunned neighbors and rolling cameras. Someone live-streamed the entire event. The internet had already dubbed her the fence enforcer, but now they were calling her Karen the combustible. As she was placed into the back of a cruiser, she kicked one of her garden gnomes and shouted that she would sue every last person who dared question her rule. The irony was nearly poetic. This was the same woman who'd fined people for flower pots, who called SWAT on me for paint, now being escorted away for actual crimes she had committed while pretending to be the moral compass of the neighborhood. After Karen was gone, something incredible happened. The neighborhood bloomed. The tension lifted like a fog burned away by the sun. People painted their fences, mowed their lawns together, hosted block parties, and for the first time in years, no one was scared of an anonymous fine showing up taped to their door. Kids rode bikes without being chased off sidewalk. Porch conversations became the new norm. There were no more surprise citations, no more photo surveillance, no more passive-aggressive memos about the shade of your blinds. But the story didn't end there. A week later, Riley informed me that the city was moving forward with charges against Karen for falsifying documents, misappropriation of community funds, and obstruction of an inspection. She would likely face both civil and criminal consequences. The interim HOA board announced a plan to make all future changes to policy transparent and subject to majority vote. They also introduced a new amendment dubbed the Karen Clause, which prevented any single board member from authoring or enforcing a rule without committee approval. It passed unanimously. Then, out of nowhere, I received an invitation from the local news station. They wanted to do a human interest segment titled, "The Fence That Brought Down the HOA Tyrant." I agreed, reluctantly, but insisted it not be about me, but about the neighborhood's transformation. When the story aired, it featured interviews with several residents, shots of the community gardens now thriving, and a wide-angle drone shot of my freshly painted fence. The final shot? A slow zoom out while Barkley sat in front of the fence wearing sunglasses and a bandana. The internet went wild. The green paint, once the target of a SWAT team, had become a symbol. It wasn't just about a fence anymore. It was about pushing back against intimidation. About saying no to false power. About standing up not just for yourself, but for your entire community. The neighborhood had come back to life, not because of leadership, but because the people in it decided they deserved better. As I sat on my porch one evening, watching families walking dogs, kids chalking on the sidewalk, and neighbors chatting over iced tea, I realized something. We hadn't just taken down a bully. We had reclaimed our home. Not just the property, but the peace, the freedom, the small joys that Karen had spent years choking out. And the best part? I still had half a can of forest green paint left, because I wasn't quite done yet. 3 weeks after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood looked unrecognizable, not because of anything dramatic or flashy, but because of the subtle transformation in everyone's posture, attitude, and rhythm of daily life. It was like a pressure valve had finally been released. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact were now stopping mid-walk to chat. Lawns that were once mowed out of fear were now groomed with pride. Fences once dulled by HOA-mandated beige were now proudly repainted in warm woods, deep reds, and even a cheerful blue one on Elm Street that had Karen still been around would have triggered a meltdown. The once dreaded HOA was being reshaped into something people actually wanted to participate in. It wasn't perfect yet, but for the first time it was real, transparent, human. I didn't plan to stay involved in HOA business. I'd never even attended a meeting before the whole fence fiasco, but one evening Greg and a couple other neighbors knocked on my door and asked me to consider running for a board position. They said the way I stood up had given people courage. I told them I was just defending my paint and sanity. But they insisted that's exactly the kind of person the board needed. After some hesitation, I agreed to run, not to control anyone, but to keep another Karen from rising again. The election was quiet, no drama this time. I was voted in unanimously as a board member. No binder. No fake citations. Just a clipboard and a promise to make decisions with the community, not over it. Our first action as the new board was to host what we jokingly called Paint It Forward Day. The idea was simple. Every homeowner who had ever received an arbitrary violation under Karen's rule could come repaint their fence, porch, or mailbox however they wanted, as long as it wasn't neon or glitter-coated, and the HOA would provide the paint. We partnered with a local hardware store, got a steep discount, and hosted the event on a Saturday with music, snacks, and even a dunk tank someone donated from a carnival rental company. Greg, bless him, volunteered to sit in the dunk tank wearing a cardboard sign that read, "Former HOA Yes Man." The line to dunk him stretched across 2 driveways. It was more than a party. It was catharsis. Eliza repainted her wind chime poles bright gold and hung new chimes shaped like planet. Marcus, the quiet neighbor with the "Paint It All" sign, added a mural to the side of his garage, a fist holding a paintbrush with the words "Respect Rules" beneath it. Even the retired Judge Carroll got in on the fun, helping a new couple stencil butterflies on their garden gate. For the first time, people were proud to show their homes off. Not in competition. In celebration. Kids ran around with popsicles. Barkley wore a green bandana and posed for pictures in front of my now iconic fence. At the end of the day, the fence was no longer mine. It belonged to everyone. In a moment that caught me completely off guard, a woman in a sharp blazer approached me with a smile. She said her name was Dana and she was the regional manager for a national home improvement brand. She had seen the Reddit thread, watched the local news story, and followed the viral TikTok that someone made with the title, "How One Fence Crushed a Tyrant." Dana said her company wanted to launch a community-inspired fence color line and wondered if I'd be interested in licensing the original green as part of the collection. I thought she was joking until she pulled out a mock-up of a product sample. It was called HOA Rebellion Green. I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my lemonade. Dana wasn't done. She said they wanted to feature our neighborhood in a short marketing campaign, photos, interviews, maybe even a short documentary. At first I hesitated, not wanting to turn our story into some brand cash grab. But she promised full proceeds from the licensing deal would go into a community beautification fund. That sealed it. I agreed on one condition, that every ad include a credit to the neighbors who made it all happen. She nodded. Deal. As the weeks passed, Karen's saga took on a life of its own online. Memes, parody videos, even a song remix featuring her famous line, "You're violating subsection 3. The city filed formal charges against her for code violations, falsified documents, and misappropriation of funds. Last I heard, she had lawyered up and was trying to file complaints against everyone from the HOA to the fire marshal to the drone operator who first exposed her backyard. None of them stuck. The courts didn't buy the drama anymore. The judge presiding over her case, ironically a neighbor's cousin, called her behavior a textbook example of unchecked entitlement weaponized through bureaucracy. Her house, once the fortress of HOA tyranny, was now on the market. The listing description read, "Charming fixer-upper with creative outbuildings. Motivated seller." No one in the neighborhood had much interest in buying it. Rumor had it someone from out of state might pick it up. All we knew was that Karen wasn't coming back. And if she tried, she'd find a community stronger than before, more united, and entirely unwilling to put up with another petty dictatorship. On my last day before officially starting as an HOA board member, I took a quiet walk around the block. I saw things I'd never noticed before. A child's chalk drawing of the fence and the words, "Thank you for color," a handmade birdhouse painted in mismatched stripes on someone's lawn, an elderly couple slow dancing to old jazz in their front yard. Little pieces of freedom that had bloomed in the wake of chaos. I got back home and found a package on my porch. No label. Inside was a framed photo, one of the drone shots from Karen's yard. Beneath it, someone had scribbled a note, "Every tyrant builds a shed. Every community has someone brave enough to knock it down." There was no signature. I smiled and hung it in the hallway. Later that evening, I hosted a final backyard gathering. Nothing fancy. Just a few neighbors, Barkley chewing on a bone, and my half can of forest green paint still sitting in the garage. We joked about what color to add next. Maybe stripes. Maybe a mural. Maybe we'd take suggestions from the kids. One thing was certain, we would never fear a paintbrush again. And just as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and we toasted with plastic cups filled with homemade lemonade, someone asked me the one question that still made me laugh. So, do you regret painting that fence? I looked around at the community reborn, the laughter echoing through what was once a battlefield of petty rules and absurd power trips, and I gave them the only answer that made sense. Not for a single second.